Hey everyone, JC here and Murdoch, and we're going to be doing in this video is speaking with Dr. Rick Fehr from the University of Western Ontario about the Baldoon Mystery. Now, before we get started on that, Rick, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, thank you, JC. A little bit about myself. Well, I'm originally from the same town as Murdoch, from Wallaceburg. And growing up, I had always heard about this really odd and fantastic story, which was really about a haunting that had occurred almost 200 years ago in our
Oh,
hometown. And I had just thought that everybody, regardless of where you are from, has a haunting in their history. So all
mhm.
towns
Oh yeah.
began with a haunting, but that wasn't the case. And as I grew older, I began to really appreciate, I guess, the complexities of this particular story, as you had said, the Baldoon Mystery.
Mhm.
And I'm currently writing a book about it,
Oh wow.
and yeah, I'm really enjoying exploring this particular story at this time in my life, at this age in my life, because um, when I was younger, I just treated it as a haunting, a poltergeist, with
Right.
any number of different events that had occurred to a Scottish family and to other members of the community.
Mhm.
But having sat with the story, having first heard it as a child, having sat with the story and meeting with descendants of some of the families that the haunting had occurred to, I'm beginning to see quite a rich depth in the types of accounts that people were reporting, and just sort of weaving all of those accounts together and asking some bigger questions, not just about life, but I would take that one step further
Mhm.
and say reality as well. So that's a little bit about me and my connection to the Baldoon Mystery.
Okay.
So for those people tuning in who absolutely know nothing about the Baldoon mystery, how would you sum it up in, like, back of a book jacket, one kind of paragraph? What is the Baldoon mystery?
Okay, I don't know if I can do it in a single paragraph, but I can perhaps offer somewhat of a vignette and weave some of the threads together. So the events began in 1829 on the Chenelle-Carte River, which is now known as the S.N.I.P.E River. And the S.N.I.P.E River is, I'd say, about a 2-minute drive west of Wallaceburg, and it's directly adjacent to Walpole Island, which is also west of where the events occurred. So it's on this tributary of the St. Clair River.
Mhm.
And the events happened as near as we can figure at some point in late summer, perhaps early fall, 1829. And we have one document that does have a very specific date. And this date is actually really key into drawing some of the larger context into what happened or potentially happened, and some of the very real effects that community members felt. In the first incidents that were reported happened to a group of women who were members of the McDonald family. And they were working in a barn weaving straw hats, and they were singing songs and just, having a merry time. It was close to harvest because the men were working in the fields. So that's how we know late summer. And as they were singing, a beam that was up in the rafters fell down. And one of the things that we often see, it's actually common in poltergeist cases, uh, an incident like this of what we might call psychokinesis, or a movement of a physical object that displays some element of mind moving it, is nobody was hurt. So a beam
Hmm.
fell and it came very close to hitting the women. And they sort of brushed it off as a freak accident. It could have been, leaning a little too much on a slant, and that's what caused it to fall.
Yeah.
But as the story goes, no sooner had they put the beam back than another one fell. And so again, they kind of stopped singing, put the second beam back up, and then a third and a fourth beam, and so on, where it kind of heightened this intense and sudden fear that there are activities happening that nobody is controlling. And reports from one of the witnesses indicate that the women ran screaming from the barn, and a passerby was in a canoe, Lachlan McDougall, and he rowed to the shore and went to see what was happening. So the story began to spread that something odd is occurring here. And quite often again, I'm going to use the term poltergeist. In poltergeist cases or in hauntings, it's kind of like a match has struck and hit something very flammable. Because after that first incident, they started noticing stones or lead sinkers flying through their windows and landing on the floor. And again, coming very close to striking someone, but never actually hitting someone. And they would pick up the stones, and the stones would be warm to the touch, which they noted as being peculiar.
Right.
So these incidents continued happening, and a British military officer was sent to investigate. And the family that seemed to be at the center of the activities, the family of John Taylor MacDonald, went so far as to have a story published in the Detroit Gazette in 1829, seeking any religious officials that have expertise in these matters to please arrive and bring this mess to a halt. So an officer by the name of, I believe his name was Lewis Bennett, went to investigate, as well as others. And they would find these stones, which they called witch stones, and they put an individual private marking on the stone, and they would chuck it in the river. So nobody had seen what the marking was.
Oh.
And then they would wait some time, and then a stone would come through the house and would land on the floor. It was wet, and it had that private marking. So
that's crazy.
So this is something that they can't explain, and it's something that is terrorizing the family. And as with many cases of, again, poltergeists, they escalated rather quickly, and there would be reports of a horse and carriage riding over the roof. So if you can just imagine, like, the entire roof trembling at night as the family is trying to sleep. So there's some very odd and unexplainable kinetic events that are occurring that are driving this family and other families to the brink of sanity, really. Yes. And one of the documents that I found not too long ago that was really peculiar to me was of another MacDonald family that also had a patriarch by the name of John MacDonald in the same community, who would report that their house would burn to the ground and everybody would barely escape with their lives. Wow. And then the next morning, after staying at a neighbor's house, they would return and the house would be there. So it's almost like Groundhog Day, where something really tragic happens, and then they return, and then nothing happened. So when I see things like that, I'm thinking, okay, well, what's happening at the level of consciousness, and what's happening at the level of reality for these people when they have these really peculiar events occurring, and then the next day it's as if nothing happened at all. Right. So I imagine that their sanity was quite threadbare and barely hanging on. And the family of John Taylor MacDonald eventually lost their barn and their house to a fire. And they had reported, several witnesses had reported balls of fire that would fly through the air and land and then set afire.
Wow.
And they had dozens of people trying to tamp these fires out and put them out. And ultimately, the fire that consumed the barn revealed the specter of this very ferocious black dog emerging in the flames, snarling at people as they tried to put it out. So again, going back to this idea of the participants, the experiencers, having their sanity worn down rather quickly. And this is really just over a period of a few months. So I know that's much more than what you were asking, just a short synopsis. Good. But I can very easily add on to some of the themes and some of the bigger ideas the further we go with questions. But I want to give you a chance to ask questions.
Yeah. The things that these people were experiencing, like poltergeist type activity, do you think possibly they were manifesting it in some way? Like, I know with some poltergeist cases, the people can actually trigger that stuff.
That's something that I can't really speculate what agency, either knowingly or unknowingly, the participants had. The one thing that I do know is that some of the events in the story, which was published by the son of John Taylor MacDonald, Neil Taylor MacDonald, in the 1870s through a series of newspaper articles in which he included witness testimony that he had gathered prior to his father dying in the 1860s. The one thing that is apparent, the deeper you look into it, is some of the events have echoes of the older storytelling tradition in Scotland, where they're from. And one of the things that I note is when you see elements of older stories finding their way into what people are experiencing, it's very easy to then say, well, then it's not true, it's false.
Right.
But I don't take a stand about the veracity of the events and the veracity of the story, whether it was true or false. And actually just take people at their word. If they say this happened to them, then let's give them some respect and actually see what we can glean from what they're saying, rather than having them pass a threshold.
Right.
And the dog in particular is peculiar, this appearance of a spectral dog. And there was another dog that would play tricks on the family by appearing on the roof of the house when they tried to catch it. And nobody owned this dog. Nobody could figure out who this dog belonged to. It was a very peculiar thing. And the family dog itself, at one point, is chased by a ladle that hops out of the cauldron and chases the dog. So back to your question, did the family or did the people themselves manifest this? I don't know. But in their accounts and in their experiences, they're relating to events that happened where they're from.
Yeah.
So stories that would have been passed down feature in their accounts. Now, what does that mean? I don't know what that means, except to say that when people are relating an event that they encounter, and we can look at any number of different incidents. Let's look at Fatima, Portugal. People see a lady in light.
Yeah.
Their first association, being Catholics, is going to be the Virgin Mary.
Yep, I've heard that.
Yeah, so similar in Baldoon, they had stories about a fairy dog, which wasn't a little dog, but it was a ferocious dog, and it was a protector of the fairy realm. And when I read the Baldoon Mystery, I'm thinking, well, that's very peculiar that the very island these people are from, and it's not like a large area, it's a very small island, has a very specific story about this dog that is a protector of the unseen in the underworld, in a sense. And it comes through very prominently in the story, the Baldoon Mystery. So yeah, I know that doesn't answer your question. They
No,
manifest it.
yeah, it does. It makes sense to me. Like do you think maybe it was demonic of some sort? Like you said, the only basic apparition was the dogs, or the dog that was seen by multiple people. Was there any other apparitions, like human forms or anything?
There were some witnesses, a small number of them reported a visual apparition, uh, auditory. I would say, the sound of the carriage going over the
Yeah,
roof would be an auditory apparition.
right.
Uh, they don't get to some of the um, I would say over the edge into insanity apparitions, because some of the older accounts that happen in North America and in throughout Europe, uh, when you read the reports, you're thinking, oh yeah, this person is really traumatized by
Mm,
what's happening because of what they're reporting to have seen
right,
or to experience. The Baldoon Mystery doesn't go quite that far. And I think one of the reasons why that happens, or why that happened with Baldoon, was with any number of different poltergeist cases. There's a researcher in Germany, Walter von Lukadu, who writes some fantastic uh, uh, studies on what they term in the parapsychological community as RSPK, or recurrent spontaneous psychokinetic phenomenon, or
mm,
psychokinesis.
yeah,
And they actually have a very effective model to show uh, the length and duration of these type of events, and then how quickly the oxygen is sucked out of these very peculiar events.
right,
And quite often, in almost every single case, these events come to a rather quick end when so much attention is paid to it, and so much attention is given to it by people who are very critical
right,
about what's happening. And it's almost as if all it takes is a certain amount of doubt, and then things will stop happening.
right.
And I know with William Roll in particular, who is a well-known Danish American parapsychologist who investigated any number of incidents in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, right up until the 90s. He would report that there was often trickery involved
Yeah,
with these events. Now, again, when you hear trickery, you think, oh, then it's all fake. And William Roll was careful to say, not necessarily, but there is a relationship between the person who seems to be at the center of these events, the events themselves, and this desire for, I guess, perhaps the perhaps the attention and the phenomena to continue.
right,
So when someone like William Roll would show up and introduce himself as this expert or parapsychologist, it would very quickly put a heaviness on the situation and on the scene. So sometimes when he would appear at an ongoing series of events, he would bring a colleague with him who was also a parapsychologist, but he would say, oh, this is just a friend. And the friend is just going to, hang around while I'm not here. And when William Roll would leave, things would happen. in the
yeah.
witness of the friend, which was also an investigator, but wasn't acting in a critical thinking role, but was
Right.
just there to witness what would happen. So there is some level of trickery that sometimes occurs. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's all to be dismissed.
Right.
But what is the role of the person who's playing the trick? We don't know, for instance, in the Baldoon Mystery, what was somebody throwing the stones through the window? Was somebody shaking the roof? What about the lights that were flying through the house? So it becomes very difficult to offer an assessment of whether something is real or not.
Right.
Now, I would just say, because I know you are into paranormal investigations, from what I've been reading and from what I've been doing, one of the greatest tools, now this might seem contradictory to you, one of the greatest tools to bring any event like this to an end is a recording device.
Mm-hmm.
Which to me is really contradictory to what you're doing, because you appear with recording devices
Right.
at events.
Yeah.
And I would say that when you're looking at cases like Baldoon, and when the one case that William Roll was investigating happened in 1969 in Miami, in which his friend, the critical observer, was introduced as just a friend. I would say that you fall into the category of having what might ultimately be presented as ambiguous, right? Like, how many times do you go to a place that is supposedly haunted, and you have something that may or may not be the phenomena, whatever the phenomena is.
Right.
It's interesting that you brought that up, because we haven't posted any of the videos upcoming yet from our investigation we just did of the Arlington Hotel. But yeah, exactly what you're saying. Like some of the things that we were able to capture, it's like you can look at it either way, right? You can say, okay, was it like some kind of mechanical malfunction, or was it, something interacting with us? And that's why with S.N.I.P.E.R, we always take that approach of leaving it, letting, people who are observing it, either clients or on our channel, we let them make that determination for themselves, right? Like we're not coming out and saying what it is. We're not putting that judgment on it. We're
And
just
of
presenting
course,
what we,
yeah. And we always try to debunk it as well. Always, because we don't want to jump to conclusions. So yeah, I totally know what you're saying. But it just makes me wonder, like the Baldoon Mystery, what triggered it to start? Like,
That's a great question.
like that's pretty interesting though, because it kind of reminds me of the uh the one in Tennessee there. What's the
the Bell Witch.
Bell Witch? Except there's no witch, but there's these dogs.
Oh no, there was a witch in the Baldoon Mystery. There
Was there?
entirely was. I haven't even got to it. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, we haven't
geez.
got there
Okay.
yet. There's definitely a witch.
All right, there's a witch coming. Let's do this. All
Yeah.
right, sorry. No, I was just wondering, but yeah, what would have basically triggered this? Was the land cursed? Was the family cursed? I mean, you got multiple witnesses experiencing these things that you were saying that too. So it's like it's crazy, but it just makes you wonder how did it all get triggered?
So if all of the options you offered was a multiple choice question on an exam, you could select all of the above as being correct.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So to your question, what triggers an event like this? I think it's important first to come out and say they almost never happen. It's very rare, and even rarer with critical eyes around us all the time. Now, in the case of the Baldoon Mystery, I think it does share some similarities to the event that I referenced earlier, and that is in Fatima, Portugal, the Lady in Light.
Yeah.
A great social tension exists. So there's a great social tension that's present. Same with the case in Miami that William Roll was investigating. There was a very disaffected employee at a warehouse that always seemed to be a trigger for events that happened. Now, in Baldoon, what was the social tension? I don't know. It could have been familial. It could have been political. You have to keep in mind they were right on the border with Michigan,
Right.
prior to what was known as the Patriots' War. These were also many of the MacDonald family members were veterans from the War of 1812.
Yeah.
They also lived on land that was in the process of being cleared of the indigenous population. So that also would have presented very real tensions within the community. And the Patriots' War that happened a few short years after Baldoon actually featured members of the extended MacDonald family being kidnapped by Americans and being held for ransom. So, like,
Wow.
there was very real tension. But what specific tensions? I can't speak to that. But it's almost like an impossible. You need almost impossible conditions for a situation to get out of hand as it did at Baldoon. Now, as to the witch, one of the things that is really peculiar with these types of incidents, I would say, prior to the Victorian period and definitely prior to industrialization, is they would seek the help of, in this particular case, they sought the help of Pennsylvania Dutch hexmeisters. That's just a cool word to begin with, hexmeister, right? So like a master of hexing.
Yeah.
And these people did exist. John Troyer was one of them, and he lived in Long Point, and he was apparently proficient in rooting out witches. And that's what he would do. He would travel around, and if
He was
there
a
were,
witch hunter.
he was a witch hunter. He was
Nice.
the term was witch doctor, but absolutely, you could describe him as a witch hunter.
Van Helsing.
Yeah, he was basically a Van Helsing type
That's cool.
character.
Yeah.
And there's actually an excellent article in the Walrus magazine written about John Troyer by one of his descendants, and it was published, I believe, the last couple of years. There was another hexmeister involved, and it's through the other hexmeister, a man by the name of Robert Barker, that we are able to actually dot a lot of the I's and cross a lot of the T's, because he was arrested in 1830 for his activities at Baldoon in trying to bring the case to a resolution. So I have a chapter in my book focused directly on Robert Barker, but I'm also publishing a paper on Barker and his activities and being arrested for doing this. And the charge that was brought against him was pretending to practice witchcraft.
I thought witchcraft was gonna be
Yes.
mentioned.
So, but pretending to practice witchcraft is
Yeah.
not witchcraft. Pretending
No.
to practice witchcraft is a fraud charge. So the fraud charge brought against him was soliciting money for the aid of spiritual services.
Oh, yeah.
Now, Barker, as well as the primary witnesses, John MacDonald and John's cousin Hector MacDonald, all professed and testified, saying that at no point did this school teacher, he happened to be the headmaster of the school in Sombra, at no point did he ask for money. So no fraud charge. He was still convicted. The charge was overturned. And Barker, in his testimony, was saying that this is all about land. This was a matter of land that, this is John MacDonald's testimony about Barker, saying that Barker said that there was a land deal that wasn't resolved in Scotland. And the spirits of the ancestors are trying to alert John MacDonald's father, a man named Daniel MacDonald, to return to Scotland to restore this land deal that had gone wrong. So it was this very ambiguous and strange response that Barker offered. John Troyer came right out and said, "Oh no, it's a witch. It's just a witch." And Troyer said, you can expose the witch by shooting it with a bullet molded of silver. And if you shoot a particular animal that's swimming up and down the river, and then he said, have you happened to have noticed a goose with a black head? And John said, well, yeah, it's a very strange bird. And then Troyer said, well, if you shoot this bird, then that will reveal the witch. And it happened to be in the story written by Neil MacDonald. He shoots this bird with a silver bullet. And the next day, the old neighbor woman has her arm in a sling, right? So
really?
It's exposed as being
Wow.
the same. So yeah, you have to imagine this is a story that happened 200 years ago.
Yeah.
So any attestation to historical veracity is very thin. We can look to folklore, and we can look to echoes of similar occurrences that happen. Now, prior to the Victorian period and industrialism, these cases, the Bell Witch being a perfect example of it, and the Baldoon Mystery being another example of it, have these very phenomenal cast of shapeshifters, these larger than life, more than human beings in the form of these massive dogs. And in the case of the Bell Witch, there was a dog with a rabbit head, and the characters that don't physically exist but are reported by these people. After the Victorian period and after industrialism, similar events happen, but they're very focused to the household without witches and all of these added characters for the most part. Because some stories you do get, like the Exorcist was based off of a poltergeist / possession that involved the Catholic Church. So this is a very old tradition within Catholicism, demonology. You would ask the question about a demon. So in the case of, I think the book was The Devil Went to St. Louis, that documents that particular case of possession. Okay. If William Roll, for instance, were to investigate, let's say if William Roll was alive in 1829, if he investigated Baldoon, if he investigated what became The Devil Went to St. Louis, would there be possession? Would there be giant black dogs? Would there be balls of fire flying through the air? Because the scope of William Roll's investigations were very quantitative. Mm-hmm. He was open to experiential elements and witnessed many things himself, but not to the point of these elaborate beings appearing, which, as I said, most often happen in the 1800s. So,
right. Wow.
Yeah.
That's cool. I have about 1,000 questions I want to ask you, but I recently had the pleasure of watching you give a lecture at Trent University on the Baldoon Mystery, and I didn't really get a chance to ask these questions then, but now I have one for sure that I was dying to ask you that night. And that was when I was listening to you talk, especially when you mentioned the Fae and folklore aspects of these phenomena. I was listening to you talk, and I was recognizing, especially in the Baldoon story, these archetypal figures, right, and archetypal situations. And being a mythology nerd and a folklore nerd, um, I just found it amazing how the Baldoon mystery, like the Bell Witch, and like so many of these stories, have these archetypal figures and situations in them. What? How does that speak to you? Like, what do you see the same thing in these stories?
I do, and it was pointed out at one time that, and I don't think I actually mentioned this in an article that I had published, but it's going to find its way into the book. John MacDonald molds a bullet of silver, which has alchemical significance to it and archetypal significance to it as well, perhaps being associated with the feminine. And he uses this bullet to expose the witch that happens to be a woman. So yeah, there are some definite threads to patriarchy and I would say violence in the Baldoon Mystery. And Marty Gervais and James Rainey wrote an absolute standout play called Baldoon, in which they explore these elements in a very nuanced way, where they're exploring the relationship of settler family and settler family life. And in the case of Rainey and Gervais, they work in another element, and that is the parapsychological community really became focused on the role of adolescence in poltergeist activities. And if you look at William Roll's research, quite often there's an adolescent figure, either a boy, most often a girl, that seems to be at the center of these activities. Now, when I spoke at Trent, I didn't mention any of this, but in plays like Baldoon and in a lot of literature, well, there isn't much literature on Baldoon, but on the literature of Baldoon, there's always this character that comes through of being of this adolescent girl that was adopted into the MacDonald family. And that itself, I think, has some archetypal significance that wasn't evident at the time. It's nowhere in Neil T. MacDonald's book, but it comes out generations afterwards, where this seemingly new character is thrown into the Baldoon Mystery. There's maybe 2 mentions of a young girl who visits the family, but so much hay is made of this girl in later generations that it's really peculiar to see how generations after a story is published and generations beyond generations after the events occur, how much we input our own fears, right, desires, and understandings of the universe, of reality, and of life into stories like the Baldoon Mystery, just as they might have at the time when these events were happening. The black dog might not have been a black dog as we know a black dog, but it might have carried a very significant archetypal message to them. A guardian of the underworld, right, is right at your doorstep. So that is pretty darn significant.
Yeah, and I was thinking too, the dog could represent the trickster archetype, right? And then you have the crone as well with the old neighbor woman, right? So a lot of these figures just seem to manifest throughout these stories. Something else I wanted to ask too. Sorry to hog the conversation here, guys,
Oh, that's
but
fine.
um, and maybe JC, you can jump in on this one too. But when a haunting, when something like this is going on, when when it gets the label of poltergeist, is there specific activity that you would look for where you would designate it and say, okay, this story, this seems to be poltergeist activity, whereas this story doesn't? What would the criteria be that would make you think that way?
That is a very a very good question, and it's one of those contextual questions because Christopher Larson, a good friend and mentor of mine in this particular field, when I was first writing a paper about the Baldoon Mystery, I kept calling it an RSPK, recurrent spontaneous psychokinetic event. And he said, be careful what you call this thing, this event. And I said, well, then I'll call it a poltergeist. And he said, again, be careful what you call this thing, because a poltergeist from the German noisy ghost, right?
Yeah.
But when I say poltergeist in 2023, it will immediately, I think, bring people to The Conjuring or any
They're
James,
here.
yeah,
Yep. Yep.
or Steven Spielberg.
Yeah.
So the terminology itself is tricky because once you name something, you sort of dress it in uh, 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 the baggage
Right.
that comes with that terminology. So RSPK, poltergeist, haunting as well is one of those terms. And actually, there's a quote. I'm just going to find it quickly from Ursula K. Le Guin, and it really speaks to this problematic nature of naming these things. I actually want to find the interview in which she said this. She wrote or said, I think that things happen in nature that we don't altogether understand, and to call them ghosts is to make sure we will not understand. The best we can do is not to put a name to them, but to listen. Right?
Right.
That's like, there you go. That's
Yeah.
why I love our
Amazing.
work so much.
Amazing.
Yeah, so there's a power when you name things,
Yeah.
and so I am careful when I refer to the Baldoon Mystery. I'll say, it has elements of haunting and elements of poltergeist, and I believe in the talk I gave at Trent, I did refer to a couple working definitions. One from William Roll, in which he talks about haunting. So haunting, haunt, has in Old English root that means home. So it's a homing. Something is the spirit
Right.
is returning home or is making its presence known in a home. And poltergeist, from my limited understanding, really refers to physical manifestations somewhat similar to haunting, related often to ghosts, or at least that's what the common imagination or the popular imagination might label it as,
Right.
being the work of unseen discarnate entities, so ghosts. So yeah, but
It's
there's
kind of like,
power in naming.
yeah.
Rick, when you recently, I guess it was a couple of years ago now, you went to a fishing camp or a hunt. Was it a fishing camp or a hunting camp up in Northern Ontario? And you experienced some interesting activity up there. And what was that like? Was that similar to the kinds of things that were in the Baldoon story?
So the events that you're talking about, I don't know if they're still ongoing, but I had said earlier that typically these types of things they happen for several weeks or several months, and then the oxygen kind of gets sucked out of them. The hunt camp is really peculiar because things have been reported for decades at this particular place, and there are, and this is, one of the things that I've learned from Christopher is that very rarely will there be a persistent or ongoing series of unexplained events that occur sometimes over a lifetime or multiple lifetimes. And I like to think that what happened up north is one of those things, or one of those series of events. Now, the interesting thing about what happened up north, and when I went there, I think it was 2017, so a few years now, or 2018, one of those years. What was really clear to me, or not clear at the time, but became clear to me, is the power of stories in these particular activities, in these particular events. And when I arrived there at this hunt camp, it was with a friend who worked at the hunt camp, and she introduced me as an expert. It's like, no, don't do that. I think I instinctively knew that would sort of, sort of suck the oxygen out of what may or may not happen. Not that I wanted anything to happen, but it was a very peculiar experience there. Now, in terms of the scale of, let's say, Bell Witch, Baldoon Mystery happening pre-Victorian, pre-industrial times, the types of things that happen or that have been reported at this hunt camp, apparitions, psychokinetic events, and just one of the stories that my friend told was they were sitting around having Thanksgiving. So this is the off season of summer campers, and hunters and fishers, but they open for different hunting activities throughout the fall, and they were sitting around having a Thanksgiving dinner, and you just imagine, there's maybe half a dozen people having a good time, just chit-chatting, and they look over and they notice that there's a coffee cup on its side on the table, and they just put it up. And then they continue eating and joking. And the same coffee cup is on its side again. And they would write it like 3 or 4 times. And then it became a joke. Oh, I wonder when it's going to knock. And then sure enough, it would knock over. Or a ladle would fall off of a hook. One of the more peculiar things that would happen in the final years of my friend's employment there is that there would be apparitions of her in places where she wasn't, auditory and visual, which is really peculiar, or maybe just auditory, but hearing her speak around the corner when she's not there. And I have had similar things happen where it's, I'm going outside to join so-and-so. It wasn't at this hunt camp, but in different other locations. And I go outside and they're not there when I swear I just saw them. And so,
that's weird.
It goes back to what I was first talking about. And that is, what is consciousness, right? What is reality?
Yeah.
I think when we're in nature and we look at things like trees and we look at different patterns, it's ubiquitous. So like a leaf is a leaf is a leaf, and you see leaves everywhere when you're in the bush. The same thing is true with our relationships with the people that we love and the people that we're around. So we see them perhaps out the door one moment, and then that moment might sort of imprint itself on us. So the next time I see that person out there, I go to join them and they're not there.
Yeah.
So, what are these events that happen, and what is their relationship to consciousness, and what then happens if we're talking about people such as the Baldoon settlers who were living in a very traumatic situation, having survived one war, about to go into another, and having uncertainty all around them. What was the family relationships like? So these are people you're around all the time, and who knows what role that may have had. So yeah, I know that was a very elaborate answer, and it didn't address your questions, Murdoch, because I'm thinking we can talk about the hunt camp a different night in more elaborate detail.
Right on. There's more to
Actually,
it. Cool.
Yeah, JC and I figure we'll probably get you on for about 5 or 6 different episodes now at this point, because
Yes,
it's like we
like
want
a
to talk
ball
about the
of
Bell
knowledge.
Witch. Yeah, we want to talk
It's
about
great.
poltergeist. So tonight was basically like a sampler, an introduction to.
Yes.
Um,
And I found it very interesting about the Baldoon. I like it. It's cool. Thank you.
yeah, that was awesome, Rick. Thank you
Yeah.
so much for coming on the show with us. That was great.
And we
So
can't wait
what
to see you back on here soon.
Yeah, no
so
problem.
so what is next for Dr. Rick Fehr? What are you working on now? You said you were working on a book of about the Baldoon mystery.
Yeah, I'm working on a book about the Baldoon mystery, but I'm going to be starting a course on podcasting. So
Nice.
I think I did share
Right
that
on.
with you, but it's going to be a future development. I want to learn the craft, basically, and it's because I'm so interested in storytelling that I want to be a humble student and figure out what all of this is. So and
awesome.
that's just it.
Yep. That's awesome. Thanks so much, Rick, for coming on here. And I'm sure our viewers enjoyed it because we sure did.
Well, I
So
appreciate the invitation.
no problem. You'll be back. So yeah, so I hope everybody enjoyed that. And if you did, hit the like, hit the subscribe, and get notified when we post new videos. And we'll leave you with that.